All right, we're starting session 2. And if you're watching us on Facebook Live, this is the second session of our God and Country number 2 seminar. The title of this one is The American Miracle, or Miraculous America, where we're covering the miracles of America. And it's 4 sessions. If you're watching now, this is the second session. They're about 45 minutes long each session, and then we're going to take a break at lunchtime. So you should be able to catch our next session. Session 3 will be after lunch, about 1:30. And then session 4, the last session, will be about 2:30 if you're watching on Facebook Live. That's how you can schedule yourself. And let us know that you're watching. Send us a text. Let us know that you're watching so we know that the word is getting out as well. Okay? All right. Second session, we're going to talk about a time in America's history. We talked earlier about the founding era. Now we're trying to be established as a nation. The French is still a problem. Okay? Now let me just go on with our notes and then we'll talk about it a little bit. We're going to talk about the Battle of Monongahela. And our source is Wall Builders, which is one of our primary sources. Another well-documented, but today unfamiliar part of America's godly heritage involves the account of a young George Washington during a fierce military battle in which his life precariously hung in the balance for 2 hours, but was miraculously spared. In fact, following that event, Washington himself openly acknowledged that it had been by the direct intervention of God that he remained alive. The incident occurred during America's French and Indian War, 1753 to 1763. At that time, England and France, two long-standing bitter enemies that had warred against each other for centuries in Europe, claimed the same land in America along the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. They went to war to settle that dispute. Those living in America at the time took sides, with most of the Indians joining the French and most of the American colonists joining the British. Great Britain, seeking to drive the French from the inland parts of America, dispatched 2,300 hand-picked veteran British troops to the colonies. Those troops, under the command of distinguished veteran General Edward Braddock, arrived in Virginia and were joined by 100 Virginia buckskins, led by their 23-year-old Colonel George Washington. They then set out for the mouth of the Ohio River to expel the French from Fort Duquesne, now the city of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Having marched hundreds of miles, Braddock temporarily halted his troops at Fort Cumberland. They were still more than 100 miles from the French fort, but Fort Cumberland would serve as a staging ground for the attack. Braddock dispatched his force in 4 waves, with himself, George Washington, the Virginians, and 1,200 chosen British troops comprising the 3rd wave and principal military force. The first 2 groups had been the engineering force with its workers and military protection sent out to open a road through the wilderness. The 4th group was the baggage and equipment wagons bringing up the rear. By July 9th, 1755, Braddock's 4th had moved within 7 miles of the French fort, and while following a path leading through a wooded ravine, they marched into a waiting ambush. The French and Indians opened fire on them from both sides. Fortunately, Braddock's group was composed largely of Indians, of battle-hardened British veterans accustomed to war. But unfortunately, they were veterans of European wars. European warfare was traditionally conducted in the open. One army lined up at one end of an open field, the other army lined up at the opposite end. They faced each other, took aim, and fired. The British now found themselves in the Pennsylvania woods, with the French and Indians firing at them from the tops of trees, behind rocks, and under logs. The British were completely unfamiliar with woodland warfare. When they came under fire, they responded according to their training and lined up, shoulder to shoulder, along the bottom of the ravine. Not surprisingly, they were promptly slaughtered. Over the next 2 hours, 714 of the 1,300 British and American troops were shot down. with only 30 of the French and Indians being shot. Nearly all of those by Washington's Virginia buckskins who were accustomed to woodland warfare and sought cover when the attack began. Even among the officers, the British losses had been enormous. Of the 86 British and American officers in that battle, 26 were killed and 36 more wounded. Significantly, George Washington was the only mounted officer not shot down off his horse. And he had been particularly vulnerable, having courageously ridden back and forth along the front lines, delivering General Braddock's orders among the troops. Late in the battle, General Braddock was seriously wounded, and Washington took charge, gathering the remaining troops and heading back toward Fort Cumberland. Along the way, Braddock died, and on his death, Washington performed the role of a military chaplain, conducting the funeral service, reading scriptures, and offering prayers. Braddock's body was buried in the middle of the road, with wagons driving over his grave to prevent the Indians from finding and desecrating his remains. Washington and remaining troops arrived back at Fort Cumberland on July 17th. During the week-long return to the fort, word had spread across the colonies that the slaughter of the British and Americans had been complete, that the entire force had been wiped out. So after his safe arrival at the fort, Washington wrote a letter to his family, assuring them that despite reports to the contrary, he was still very much alive. And I quote, he said this, he said, "As I have heard since my arrival at this place, a circumstantial account of my death and dying speech, I take this early opportunity of contradicting both and assuring you that I now exist and appear in the land of the living." Having confirmed his safety to his family, he then recounted what had occurred during the battle, that when he had removed his jacket at the end of the battle, he found 4 bullet holes through it, but not a single bullet had touched him. Wow. He had horses shot out from under him. He had 2 horses shot out from under him, but he had not been scratched. He therefore concluded, quote, "I now exist and appear in the land of the living by the miraculous care of Providence that protected me beyond all human expectation." As word of God's divine protection of Washington spread across the colonies, the Reverend Samuel Davies even referred to the incident in a sermon only a few weeks after the momentous battle. Davies was a leader in the American revival of the Great Awakening and was considered the greatest pulpit preacher in America. Significantly, the devastating defeat of the British troops left American settlers on the frontier completely unprotected. They therefore banded together into volunteer military companies to defend their homes against the impending French and Indian attack. The special sermon by Reverend Davies was delivered to a group of these citizens just before they marched out. In that sermon, Davies told the brave volunteers, quote, "And has God been pleased to diffuse some sparks of this martial fire through our country? I hope he has. As a remarkable instance of this, I may point out to the public that the heroic young youth, Colonel Washington, whom I cannot but hope Providence has hitherto preserved in so signal a manner for some important service to his country." Right? Right? He didn't know that 20 years after that, he would be the first president of the United States of America. But even then, he sensed that God had put him apart, had protected him, because God had a special assignment for this young man, 23-year-old colonel. Davies' expected hope for the young Washington proved to be quite accurate. 20 years later, it was apparent that God definitely had selected Washington for an important service to his country, and the entire nation has benefited as a result. In fact, nearly 2 centuries later, President Calvin Coolidge confirmed he, Washington, was the directing spirit without which there would have been no independence, no union, no constitution, and no republic. We cannot yet estimate him. We can only indicate our reverence for him and thank the divine providence which kept him to serve and inspire his fellow man. Significantly, Washington himself recognized that the critical role he had played in America's formation was not the result of his own skills, but rather the favor of God, as he openly acknowledged, quote, "I have only been an instrument in the hands of Providence." Additional evidence of just how miraculous had been Washington's preservation in 1755 was provided 15 years later. This is interesting. 15 years later, in 1770, when Washington had occasion to return to the same Pennsylvania woods where he had earlier battled the French and Indians. An old Indian chief, hearing that Washington had come back to that area, traveled to meet him. The ancient leather-faced chief sat down with him over a council fire and announced that he had been a leader in the battle against Washington 15 years earlier. The chief recounted that during the battle, he had instructed his braves to single out the officers and shoot them down, knowing that if they could slaughter the officers, they could scatter the remaining troops and then easily destroy them later. Like the other officers, Washington had been specifically singled out. In fact, the chief proudly explained that his rifle had never before been known to miss, but after having personally fired at Washington 17 different times without effect, he concluded that Washington was under the care of the Great Spirit and therefore instructed his braves to stop firing at him. He then told Washington, quote, "I have traveled a long and weary path that I might see the young warrior of the great battle. I am come to pay homage to the man who is the particular favorite of heaven and who can never die in battle."
Wow, that's amazing.
This was an Indian who didn't know anything about our God, recognizing that God must have his hand on this man. This is our history. This remarkable account of God's direct intervention in the life of one of our national heroes appeared in American history textbooks for nearly a century and a half. It is a well-documented part of our godly heritage, but it is an account now virtually unknown. All right? That's why it's so important for us to preserve truth, because we're the minority. They're not learning this in public schools.
Nope, not anymore.
Yeah, so that's why it's really important for us to be able to know the truth so that we can pass it on to the next one. All right? So that's a good miracle, amen?
Yes.
That's a good miracle, one miracle. Let's go on to the next miracle. There.
I hope that same miracle is working on Trump.
Yeah.
Amen.
Yeah, absolutely. God isn't done with working his miracles.
They tried for 4 years to get him and they couldn't.
Right. That was George Washington with General Bragg there, still on his horse. Okay. Now, let's talk about the next thing. Now we're going to talk about the Revolutionary War. We went from the French and Indian War. Now we're going to go to the War for Independence, which in this area we have a rich history in our area. And how many of you have visited Knox headquarters in New Windsor? All right. Okay. All right.
Gotta go there.
Yeah. We're going to talk about Henry Knox here next. So let's just kind of go along with our notes. Henry Knox witnessed the Boston Massacre in 1770. Henry Knox served on guard duty to make sure no tea was unloaded from the ship Dartmouth prior to the Boston Tea Party in 1773. The British blockaded Boston's harbor in 1774. British General Thomas Gage arrived with 4,000 British troops and proceeded with a military occupation of the city of Boston, confiscating over 2,000 muskets from citizens. Now remember, what happened was after we had the Boston Tea Party, the king got ticked off, and he decided to blockade Boston. And his idea was he was going to bring us to our knees and make us surrender. He was going to starve us out, bring us to our knees. He came back. He brought his troops around. He blockaded them. Because there was no barracks for the British troops, he housed them in people's houses. Yeah. All right, so that was the whole thing. Imagine the king coming saying, "You need to put my troops in your house."
No way.
And you can live in the barn. You know. But my truth was that was what happened during that occupation. The British came in, they blockaded Boston. They took over the whole city of Boston, and a lot of people fled, and some people sided with the British. The whole bit. Okay, but again, I'm going to stick with my notes so I don't go off in too many tangents. British General Thomas Gage arrived with 4,000 troops and proceeded with the military occupation of the city of Boston, confiscating over 2,000 muskets from the citizens. All right, what's first things they do? Take your arms away. Take your arms away. That's why we can't let them take our arms away today. Amen. The guys were doing it back then. Henry Knox was a bookseller in Boston, having supported his family in that trade since the age of 12, when his father died in the West Indies on business. His father, William Knox, had emigrated from Scotland to Ireland to the West Indies, then to Boston, where he helped establish the Church of the Presbyterian Strangers in Boston. With the British occupying Boston, Henry Knox and his wife Lucy, age 19, sneaked out. The British looted his bookshop and used his home to lodge soldiers. That's what they did. Every home there was putting up soldiers. British commander William Howe arrived in 1775 with 4,500 more troops, and the Battle of Bunker Hill soon followed, where Henry Knox was a volunteer. General George Washington, now age 43, made Henry Knox, 25, a colonel. What's happened to my notes here? Can't get this. It's not moving. There it goes. There it goes. Okay. So on December 1st, 1775, General Washington sent Colonel Knox to Fort Ticonderoga in upstate New York. Now understand what was happening. Boston was besieged by the British. They were in control. George Washington was now appointed the commander-in-chief of this new army. And he comes to the Boston area and he sees this bunch of ragtag guys. And he doesn't know what to do with them, basically.
Thank you.
And now they're sitting on the mountains over Boston, but yet the British have control over Boston. And they say, you know, what are we going to do? We have nothing to do. So Henry Knox gets the idea. They knew that they took over, they conquered Ticonderoga, and there was a bunch of cannons there. So Henry Knox says, listen, why don't we go get those cannons? We'll bring them here, we'll mount it over Boston, and we'll make them surrender, because we'll have the cannons there. Now, first of all, it was a crazy idea because it couldn't work. But let me just go along with my text here. Knox and his men arrived at Fort Ticonderoga, put the cannons on big flat-bottom boats, and rowed them through freezing weather to the southern end of Lake George. Knox dragged the cannons across the snow as he reported to Washington December 7th, this is middle of the winter, December 1775, quote, I have made 42 exceedingly strong sleds and have provided 80 yoke of oxen to drag them as far as Springfield, where I shall get fresh cattle to carry them. I hope in 16 or 17 days to be able to present your excellency a noble train of artillery. Now understand this, it was winter, but had it not been winter, he never would have made it. Because they actually used the snow and for the sleds to be able to do that. And the river was frozen, they were able to get across the river.
Wow.
So had it not been for these adverse weather conditions, it never would have happened, all right? So they arrived at the Hudson River, but the ice was not thick enough to support the sleds, and one sank. On January 8th, 1775, Knox wrote in his diary of help provided by local farmers and pastors, quote, he went on the ice about 8 o'clock in the morning and proceeded to so carefully that before night we got over 23 sleds and were so lucky as to get the cannon out of the river, owing the assistance to the good people of the city of Albany. Okay. The 3-month endeavor of dragging the cannons over 300 miles from Fort Ticonderoga to Boston was called by historian Victor Brooks one of the most stupendous feats of logistics. Knox arrived at Cambridge, Massachusetts, and on the night of March 4th, a diversionary attack was made to distract the British, while Washington's men wrapped wagon wheels with straw to muffle the noise and frantically moved the cannon up to a strategic point on Dorchester Heights, overlooking the Boston Harbor. To make it appear even more impressive, they painted some logs to look like cannons. The next morning, an astonished British General, William Howe, looked up at Dorchester Heights and remarked, "The rebels did more in one night than my whole army would have done in 1 month." On March 6, 1776, from his Cambridge headquarters, General Washington ordered, quote, "Thursday the 7th being set apart by his province as a day of fasting and prayer and humiliation, to implore the Lord and giver of all victory to pardon our manifold sins and wickedness, and that it would please him to bless the Continental Army with his divine favor and protection. All officers and soldiers are strictly enjoined to pay all due reverence and attention on that day to the sacred duties of the Lord of hosts, for his mercies already received, and for those blessings which our holiness and uprightness of life can alone encourage us to hope through his mercy obtained." Coincidentally, on that same day, March 7th, General Howe was assembling 3,000 troops to land and charge up Dorchester Heights. But a violent snowstorm arose, causing the sea to be too turbulent for the attack. General Washington wrote his brother, John Augustine Washington, March 31st, 1776, quote, "Upon their discovery of the works next morning, great preparations were made for attacking them, but not being ready before the afternoon, and the weather getting very tempestuous, much blood was saved, and a very important blow prevented, that this most remarkable interposition of Providence is for some wise purpose, I have not a doubt." On March 8th, General Howe sent word to Washington that if the British were allowed to leave Boston unmolested, they would not burn the city on their way out. 8 days passed, and on March 16, 1776, the Continental Congress approved without dissent a resolution by General William Livingston, Congress desirous to have people of all ranks and degrees duly impressed with a solemn sense of God's superintending providence and of their duty devoutly to rely on his aid and direction, do earnestly recommend a day of humiliation, fasting, and prayer. The next day, March 17, 1776, General Howe finally ordered his troops to board their ships and evacuate Boston. Sailing away with them were about 1,000 British loyalists, including the parents of Henry Knox's wife. Henry Knox went on to fight in New York and New Jersey campaign and arranged Washington's crossing at the Delaware for the Battle of Trenton. Promoted to Brigadier General, Henry Knox fought at Princeton in the Philadelphia campaign, Germantown, Monmouth, and Yorktown. In 1782, he was promoted to be the Army's youngest Major General, and in 1785, Knox was chosen as the nation's second Secretary of War. Right. So that's the miracle of the cannons of Ticonderoga. There's no way that they could have gotten all those cannons to Boston without God's divine help, because it was like, what do we got to lose?
Yeah.
You know,
True.
that's what it was. They knew it was, and the minute that they were there on Dorchester Heights, and that's what it looked like there. Dorchester Heights was here, and Boston was here. All right, so they had the high ground. They had Boston covered with the cannons. They basically they were a threat, and that's where the British said, you know what, we're sunk. We better leave, and that's when they evacuated Boston. And they said, if you let us go, we won't burn the town down.
March 6th.
That's what we should do now.
6 and 7.
Mm-hmm.
Those dates.
Yeah.
Yep. That's miracle number, what, 4? I think that's what we're looking at. All right. Moving right along. Let's take a look at miracle number 5, which is one of my favorite. But I mean, I can tell you my own words, but I'm going to tell you my own words what happened here. Yes.
Do you have an extra packet?
Yes.
This goes in, came in late.
Yes. Hey, Roseanne. Okay. All right. There should be more. That's the last one I have here. There should be more running around somewhere. I think I made 15 packets, so there should be more somewhere. If anybody needs one, let me know. I'll get you one. Anyway, all right. Battle of Long Island. Now understand what happened here. The British. I'm not going to go. I'm going to tell you my own words. The British evacuated Boston, right? And they expected them that George Washington thought that they would go to the next biggest colony, which was New York. The truth is they went to Halifax, Nova Scotia for a while. They went up there to regroup and everything, right? Meanwhile, George Washington took his troops to New York because he figured that's where they were going to come next. So they tried to get established. They tried to recruit a lot of troops. They tried to build an army in New York, expecting the British to come to Manhattan there. So understand this. Here they are in downtown Manhattan with the Battery where they're setting up. At that point, downtown Manhattan, that was New York City. That was it. You know, up to the Bowery. That was about it. But they're there trying to get everything, you know, order and they're still their minority. Most of the people in New York are still loyal to the British Crown. All right? So they're trying to but they're expecting the British to start coming. All of a sudden, you know, one day they look out from the Battery, you know, at the between the Staten Island and Brooklyn, the Verrazano bridges. You know, they start looking out there, and all of a sudden they start seeing masts of ships coming.
Wow.
All right, and George Washington says, "Uh-oh, they're starting to come now." All right. Then, as the days go on, they start to see more and more masts of ships in the river, in the East River there in that area, until at some point there was like 400 British ships in that area. They settled in Staten Island. At that point, Staten Island was Tory land. They were settled in Staten Island. They took Staten Island, and that was their base of operations at that point. And they were gathering all around, and they were going to make an invasion of New York to get rid of the colonial troops and take the land back for the king. George Washington is looking at them, and he said, "Man, I don't know what we're gonna do. There's 400 of them, and I forget how many troops there were, but there was a lot more of them than there was of us, of ours." So what ends up happening, George Washington ends up dividing his troops because he doesn't know, are they going to come to the lower end of Manhattan, or are they going to come to Brooklyn, because that's closer to where they're at, and come us that way. So he splits up his troops. Right. What ends up happening is the king ends up sending his troops to Brooklyn there. Now, George Washington had scouts in all those areas to watch him, but there were like three ways that they expected the British to come. One was what they called the Jamaica Pass, this way. So George Washington had scouts there. They landed there, but one of the local Tories told the British about how they can come through the Jamaica Pass and come around the backs of George Washington's troops and get them from the rear. Now, George Washington had scouts there, but the scouts didn't know what the heck they were doing. So the British ended up coming up through the Jamaica Pass and coming back around the British troops. And man, they started wiping them out. Our troops started to getting wiped out from all sides. I don't know if I have a map here. I think I did. Yeah, okay, here you go. Here's where the ships were, and this is where they came. They came in two areas. This way, this was the Jamaica Pass. They came from behind. Then some came up through Flatbush, and the other ones came up towards Brooklyn Heights. Now our troops were right here. So all of a sudden, what happened was our troops, they were demolished. They were running. They weren't well trained at this point. It was a mess. So they got him up against Brooklyn Heights. There. Let me read the notes because I don't want to miss anything out. I'm going to read the notes. The British Army had surrounded Washington's troops in a great semicircle. With their backs to nearly a mile-wide East River, Howe held his position for 2 days and did not attack. Had he struck, victory would have been certain for the superior numbers of the British force. So he had their backs on the river. Now, Howe, had he just continued to advance them, he would have wiped them out totally. They had no place to go. But Howe decided, you know what, let's wait. He's thinking, we got their backs against the river. They're not going anywhere. We got our Navy is in the East River. They got them covered. Let's take a break.
Tea time.
Big mistake. Big mistake, right? First of all, then what happens is all of a sudden George Washington says, we got to get out of this place. So he orders that all the boats in the area get gathered up there, and they gather all the boats that they can, and they happen to have oarsmen from Rhode Island that were good merchant seamen. So he gets them to really start taking charge. We're going to evacuate. We're going to go to Manhattan. But the idea is that, wait a minute, how could you do that? You got the British here in the river. There, well, if we start, they're going to wipe us out if they see us crossing the river. Well, Providence all of a sudden makes the wind so that these guys can't get up here. The weather prevented them from coming into that East River where they're about to evacuate. So that night, George Washington starts putting everybody on boats, cannons, the whole army on boats, and starts rowing across the East River at that point. Now, they're sitting ducks, all right? Except that all of a sudden, a fog. A fog comes down into the river or up out of the river, all right, and covers the whole thing. And the British don't even see them. One of the British records, I forget now who he was, but he recorded in his log, he said they crossed without the sound of a wash. In other words, they didn't even hear the oars, the rowing. They didn't even hear them rowing across the river. And they couldn't see them because there was a big fog. Right? Then all of a sudden, the next morning, one of the locals, Tories, and again, we were in Tory country. One of the Tories knows that they're evacuating, so he tries to send notice to General Howe that they're getting away from you. You better come and get him. So one of the Tories goes and he tries to tell the British, but he runs into a Hessian guard area, and the Hessians don't speak English, they speak German. So the Hessian didn't know what the guy was trying to say. So the Hessian said, you know what, lock this guy up. The commander's coming in the morning, we'll take care of it in the morning. All right? So the Hessians hold that person back. The next morning, the British come and they find out what that person is saying, trying to tell them to go. So they said, you know what, we better go and find out if what this person is saying is true. So they go out to Brooklyn Heights to find out. Nobody's there. Nobody's there. Now they had, they left some of the colonials behind to set up campfires and make it look like they're still there. So they did that. But by the time that they got there, they found that they were all gone, and that they looked at the last boat that was there. They said that they caught one boat with a bunch of stragglers, drunken people, guys that were there, but that was all. The rest of them had all gone, and they said that as they looked across the river, as the fog lifted, they saw the last boat and going into Manhattan. So really that was the miracle that God worked to allow George Washington's troops to escape. Because had they not, that would have been the first and last battle of the War for Independence. They would have been totally wiped out right there on Brooklyn Heights. That would have been the end of them. But because of God's providence, you know, they were saved. That's one of my favorite miracles, because it happened in Brooklyn, where I'm from. Yeah, you know, I'm a Brooklyn boy, not Brooklyn Heights, but Brooklyn. So that's close enough. Amen. Is that a good one?
Yeah, that's an excellent.
The last paragraph on that, or the next last paragraph said, British troops hurried to the river. As they arrived, the fog lifted enough for them to see 4 boats on the East River. The only boat near enough to be captured contained 3 vagabonds who had lingered in the camp to plunder it. Otherwise, 8,000 men, with nearly all their supplies, had miraculously retreated to New York. American General Nathaniel Greene called the withdrawal from Long Island, quote, the best effected retreat I ever read or heard of. This extraordinary retreat was one of the most improbable and important events of the war, and many attributed the fortunate series of events to, quote, a peculiar providence. Mm-hmm. So, all right. Moving right along. That was miracle number 5. We're up to miracle number 6, and I had another miracle that I thought about that I didn't put in the notes. I forgot what it was, but it comes to mind. We'll talk about it. Yes.
It also kind of sets the stage for Dunkirk, where they
right, Dunkirk.
And
Exactly.
were able to get away.
Yeah, exactly. Same thing with Pharaoh when they crossed the Red Sea.
Right, exactly.
Exactly. You know, God works miracles, and He's still working them for us. All right. Battle of Saratoga, miracle number 6. Where are we here? All right, let me read on. In June 1777, British General Johnny Burgoyne was marching from Quebec, from Canada, toward Albany, New York, with an army of 7,000 British and Hessian troops. British General William Howe was supposed to be marching north up the Hudson River from New York City to Albany to divide and conquer and entrap. And at that point, they figured if they can get hold of the Hudson River, they could divide the New England colonies from the southern colonies, and they could divide them and conquer that way. Instead, without telling Burgoyne, General Howe abandoned the plan and left to capture Philadelphia, the capital of the new United States. This was in accordance with European warfare, that when an enemy's capital was captured, the war would immediately end. British General Burgoyne first recaptured Fort Ticonderoga, and in 1777 sent 500 Hessian troops to capture an American supply depot in Bennington, Vermont. To his surprise, the American General John Stark surrounded and captured them. American General Philip Schuyler, army of 1,000 men, gathered along the Mohawk River and blocked Burgoyne's route to Albany. British General Barry St. Leger was sent to scatter them. On August 6, 1777, St. Leger, with his Iroquois, Seneca, and Mohawk allies, set an ambush for the American General Nicholas Herkimer, who was marching with 800 patriots and their Oneida allies to reinforce Fort Stanwix. British-led forces fired too soon. Though Herkimer was mortally wounded, he continued giving orders, resulting in Americans holding their ground. Considered one of the bloodiest battles of the Revolution, the Battle of Oriskany made casualties of over half of the American forces, numbering 450 and 150 casualties among the British and Allies. St. Leger would have won had it not been for the Americans' mass courage, aided by a sudden torrential rain for over an hour that soaked the priming of their muskets and allowed Herkimer to regroup. This battle strategically kept British reinforcements from helping Burgoyne. As General Burgoyne continued down the Hudson Valley, individuals living in frontier New York settlements who were loyal to Britain joined his forces. One such loyalist living near Saratoga was David Jones, who recently became engaged to his fiancée, Jane McCrae. Burgoyne made a treaty with the Mohawk tribe to terrorize American settlements. Indians would return to the camp from their nightly raids, yelling and proudly displaying the scalps of their victims. One night, to his dismay, loyalist David Jones recognized one of the scalps of long, beautiful hair. It was that of his fiancée, Jane McCrae. Shockingly, the Indians had shot and scalped her. The reality of this brutal behavior is in stark contrast to the idealized 18th century sentimental literary character known as the noble savage. An outrage erupted in the British camp when it became known that Indians had killed the fiancée of a British soldier. This resulted in Burgoyne having to meet with the Indians and tell them to show restraint. The Indians became offended and left Burgoyne stranded deep in the frontier forest. The British were now at a great disadvantage, as the Indians had been their eyes and ears, giving reconnaissance of the Americans' position. Jane McCrae's death was later immortalized in James Fenimore Cooper's novel, The Last of the Mohicans. Remember that one?
Yeah.
The shocking account of her death rallied Americans and caused ranks to increase to 15,000. France responded by secretly sending blankets and provisions to resupply the American troops. All right? So poor McCrae's death. Poor Jane. You know, she was one of the cause that caused us to win the Battle of Saratoga. All right, moving right along. Miracle number 7. See, that's what's good about our area, because there's so much history in our area that we can relate to a lot of this stuff. The next one is moving right along here. That was another miracle I was thinking about. I can't think of what it was, but anyway, okay. It'll come to me. The capture of Andre, Benedict Arnold's treason. Now we're up to 1780, the year 1780. Late in the war, American General Benedict Arnold devised a treacherous secret plan to hand a key American fort and General George Washington over to the British. That treasonous plot was uncovered through what Washington described as a combination of extraordinary circumstances. Quote, British Major General Jean Andre had secretly met with General Arnold at an American-held West Point, New York. Andre obtained from Arnold vital information on how and when to capture that fort and then either kill or capture General Washington. Dressed in civilian clothing, Andre returned from that meeting to a British-held region of the state to deliver the crucial information to his superiors. When he reached the British-controlled area, he encountered some folks he assumed to be British supporters, but who were actually American militiamen dressed as common citizens. Andre talked too freely to them, which aroused their suspicion. They searched him and found incriminating secret papers hidden in the bottom of his boot. Andre offered them large amounts of money to release him, but they refused. As Washington himself later affirmed, quote, they, the American militiamen, were offered, I am informed, a large sum of money by Andre for his release, and as many goods as they would demand, but without effect. Their conduct gives them just claim to the thanks of their country. Those American soldiers had refused to be bribed or bought, no matter what Andre offered. They must have been Republicans. The militiamen took Andre to the nearest American military post, where the commanding officer carried the news of his immediate superior, General Benedict Arnold, not realizing that Arnold was actually part of the plot. Arnold, now having been accidentally warned of Andre's capture and the plan's exposure, fled to the British lines for safety. but had not Arnold's treasonous plans been providentially uncovered, West Point and General Washington would surely have fallen into British hands, which would have been a defeat too great for the Americans to overcome. God once again intervened to save American army and its fight for freedom, as Washington affirmed to his troops, quote, "Treason of the blackest dye was yesterday discovered. General Arnold, who commanded at West Point, lost to every sentiment of honor, of public and private obligation, was about to deliver that important post into the hands of the enemy. Such an event must have given the American cause a deadly wound, if not a fatal stab. Happily, the treason was been timely discovered to prevent the fatal misfortune. The providential train of circumstances which led to it affords the most convincing proof that the liberties of America are the object of divine protection." General Washington later told Colonel John Lawrence, quote, "In no instance since the commencement of the war has the interposition of Providence appeared more conspicuous than in the rescue of the post and garrison of West Point from Arnold's villainous perfidy." That old word they used then for treachery. When the Continental Congress learned of the event, they too saw God's hand in the affair, and therefore recommended the state set aside a day of public thanksgiving and prayer. Congress asked the people not only to praise and thank God for his direct intervention in uncovering the secret treason, but also to ask him to pardon their sins and upon their endeavors, and cause the knowledge of Christianity to spread over all the earth. See that with every miracle, you see prayer. Understand this. They prayed. There were two basic prayers, types of prayers that they prayed. Either they were praying for God's help, or they were praying for thanksgiving for God having helped. You know, God's people will always call them. But every one of these miracles, prayer is always attached. Either they're praying for God to rescue us, or they're thanking God for having rescued us. Amen. That's a good one, because that takes place right here at West Point. Our first church that we planted was right outside of the gates of West Point. It's an interesting story how God works in issues like this. We planted the Highland Falls Assembly of God, and because it was a Pentecostal fellowship outside the gates of West Point, West Point had a rule for their cadets that they had to worship on West Point, on the base, unless there was they believed in a faith that West Point didn't have facilities for or a service for. At that point, we were Pentecostals, and this was back in 1985, when Pentecostalism wasn't dignified enough to have a service on West Point. So if they had cadets who were Pentecostal, they would allow them to come to our church because they didn't have services for them on West Point. So we had a couple of dozen cadets in our services on Sundays for that reason. Then all of a sudden I come to church one Sunday and there's no cadets. So I'm saying, where's all the cadets? Then somebody told me, well, because they were coming here, the West Point chaplain decided that they better get a Pentecostal chaplain on West Point to keep their cadets from going off post on Sunday morning. So in some way, God used our little church to make Pentecostalism dignified enough for West Point to get a chaplain of the Pentecostal faith. So anyway, so that's how God used us there. Anyway, that had nothing to do with what we're doing there. Anyway, moving right along. Somebody say moving right along. All right. How we doing time-wise? We're doing good. Okay. All right. Next miracle. Miracle number 8. Battle of Cowpens. We're still in the Revolutionary War. January 17th, 1781. Depicted in the movie The Patriot. Anybody see that movie? Good one. All right. Movie was made off of this battle. It involved General Daniel Morgan, who provokes the British, including Colonel Bannister Tarleton's dragoons, into chasing them over a hill where his troops were waiting for them. The Continentals then killed 110 British and captured 830. So now they retreated across the Catawba River, which then suddenly rose, causing a delay for Tarleton's troops. Then they went on to the Yadkin River, where again the river rose after the colonials crossed. Then finally they got across the Dan River, where once again the flash flood rose between the Continentals and the butcher Tarleton. British Commander Henry Clinton wrote this. He said, quote, "Here the Royal Army was again stopped by a sudden rise of the waters, which had only just fallen almost miraculously to let the enemy over." In March of 1781, General Washington wrote to William Gordon, quote, "We have abundant reason to thank Providence for its many favorable interpositions in our behalf, and it has at times been my dependence, for all other resources seem to have just failed us." So understand what happened here. First Daniel Morgan, he tries to lure them, the British, to come after him, because he's got his guys waiting over the hill. All right, so they come, and they come. So his guys, when they come over the hill, we massacre the British. But now Tarleton gets ticked off and says, "We better go after them." So they start chasing them, and every time we cross a river, all of a sudden there's a flash flood. You know, and you couldn't choreograph this thing any better. You know, so every time, though, even they recognize that, man, God had to be in this thing. Because every time they come to chase us, they come a river. So that's Miracle 8, the Battle of Cowpens. All right, and this is before we break lunch, we're going to look at the last one here for now. The Miracle in Philadelphia, and this is an important one.
Where is Cowpens and what colony?
In Pennsylvania.
Oh, this was in Pennsylvania.
Yeah. Okay, or Maryland. I forget if it's Pennsylvania or Maryland. I think it might have been Maryland. But you could make it's your homework assignment.
Yeah.
Look it up, find out what it is. Okay. All right. Miracle of Philadelphia. The article was originally published on The Stream. To read the article, go on their website. That's where I got this one from. Quote, "It's easy to forget that our country almost choked to death in the cradle. Of course, we won freedom from Britain in 1783. But for the first years after that, things didn't go well. Rebellions festered. Congress was bankrupt. That does, now it comes to me the other miracle I was going to talk about, the miracle in Newburgh.
Oh, yeah.
You know what the miracle in Newburgh was?
They wanted Washington to be king.
Exactly. Understand this. In Newburgh, this isn't in your notes. I'll just tell you about it. Washington's headquarters was here at the cantonment. This was toward the end of the war, pretty much. But what happened was that things weren't going too well. The troops had not been paid. Congress didn't know what the heck they were doing. The military wanted to make a military coup and make George Washington the king or somebody king, because things weren't happening. The George Washington himself, he decided, he heard what was going on, so he said, I got to quell this thing down. Otherwise, the troops, they were about to march onto Philadelphia, and they were going to take over Congress, and they were going to take over and make it a military dictatorship or whatever they could. They hadn't been paid, so the officers were really, really ticked off at this point. So George Washington said, basically, I have to do something. So he came before his officers here at Washington's headquarters. He came and he stood before his officers, and he basically started to tell them, listen guys, we can't do this. If we do this now, all the cause of the revolution that we've been fighting for freedom is going to be down the drains. He said, I need you guys to really be on the same page with me. And at that point, he went and he took out his spectacles to read his speech. All right? And they say that at that point, when he took out his spectacles, he told them, he said, gentlemen, you'll excuse me, but in the course of war, not only have I gotten gray, but I've also lost my sight. And they say when he said that, it really broke the hearts of the audience. I said, same spirit. But it broke their hearts. And it caused them all to come together and give up their idea of building a military dictatorship. And they hung in there with George Washington at that point. Wow. That's not in your notes, but it should have been, because that's a miracle here at Newburgh.
Wow.
That happened. That it was when he actually took out his glasses, they said, the historians say, and he told his men, gentlemen, not only have I turned gray during the war, but I've lost my sight. That's what broke their hearts and quelled that rebellion at that point. Anyway, okay. Okay, where was I? It's easy to forget that our country almost choked to death in the cradle. I read that, right? Let me continue. For almost the first years after that, the thing did not go well. Rebellions festered. Congress was bankrupt. The Continental Army still unpaid. And it had taken all of Washington's goodwill with the troops to prevent them from marching on Congress to form a military government. Indeed, the fledgling American experiment seemed to be failing. So in the summer of 1787, those who had led the war for independence, Washington, Hamilton, Madison, Franklin, and others, gathered with other delegates in Philadelphia to see what they might do to save the new country. That gathering came to be known as the Constitutional Convention. 13 colonies represented there were bitterly divided. Leaders of large and populous states like Pennsylvania had serious quarrels with their counterparts like Rhode Island, and states with slave populations warily looked to protect their peculiar and wicked institution from those states that frowned on it. What kind of constitution could they create to bridge all of these painful differences? They wanted a small and limited government, but if it was too small, there would be anarchy. And if it was too big, the noble ideas of self-government and liberty would be destroyed. There were many other questions and dangers. Would a strong president turn into a king? Would a weak central government make us prone to foreign conquest? Drawing up the U.S. Constitution was a massive and unprecedented work of political prudence, and by all accounts, their efforts in that room were failing dramatically. In fact, there came a day when most of the founders present believed that they had already in fact failed, that their meeting must break up without any agreement, and the country would be forced to limp along as it was already doing until it tore itself apart. But it was just then, when the disagreements and arguments had mounted to an impossible height, that the eldest delegate, Benjamin Franklin, surprised the room. He was 81 years old at this point. The man's history often remembers, along with Jefferson, as among the more secular of the founders, actually gave a speech to the assembly in which he implored them to turn to God. The fact that Franklin should be to beseech the assembly to turn to God in prayer for an answer to their problems is evidence that their desperation, and for those of us who've forgotten how seriously all the founders took God, it is startling. Here is his remarkable speech. Now understand this, at this point they had been together for weeks, and they couldn't come to any kind of resolution, to an agreement. There was arguments and everything else. You had the slave states that were against the free states against the slave states. They were arguing about how to represent by population. It was a mess. So 81-year-old Ben Franklin finally gets up and he says this. And I forgot my Ben Franklin glasses. I had them at home when I read them. But he said this, and he addressed to the president of the convention, who was George Washington. So he's addressing him, and he says Mr. President, the small progress we have made after 4 or 5 weeks, close attendance and continual reasoning with each other, our different sentiments and almost every question, several of the last producing as many nays as yeas. It's methinks a melancholy proof of the imperfection of the human understanding. We indeed seem to feel our own want of political wisdom, since we have been running about in search of it. We have gone back to an ancient history for models of government and examined the different forms of those republics which have been formed with the seeds of their own dissolution, now no longer exist. And we have viewed modern states all around Europe, but find none of the constitution suitable to our circumstances. In this situation of this assembly, groping as it were in the dark to find political truth, and scarce able to distinguish it when presented to us, how has it happened, sir, that we have not hitherto once thought of humbly applying to the Father of lights to illuminate our understanding? In the beginning of the contest with Great Britain, when we were sensible of danger, we had daily prayer in this present room for divine protection. Remember, this is the same room where 10 years before then, they were praying for God's deliverance from the British. They were still in Independence Hall in Philadelphia. Our prayers, sir, were heard, and they were graciously answered. All of us who were engaged in the struggle must have observed frequent instances of a superintending providence in our favor. To that kind providence we owe this happy opportunity of consulting in peace on the means of establishing our future national felicity. And have we now forgotten that powerful friend? I have lived, sir, a long time, and the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth, that God governs in the affairs of men. And if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, is it probable that an empire can rise without his aid? We have been assured, sir, in the sacred writings, that except the Lord build a house, they labor in vain that build it. I firmly believe this, and I also believe that without his concurring aid, we shall succeed in this political building no better than the builders of Babel. We shall be divided by our little partial local interests. Our projects will be confounded, and we ourselves shall become a reproach and byword to future ages. And what is worse, mankind may hereafter from this unfortunate instance despair of establishing government by human wisdom and leave it to chance, war, and conquest. I therefore beg leave to move that henceforth prayers imploring the assistance of heaven and its blessings on our deliberations be held in this assembly every morning before we proceed to business, and that one or more of the clergy of the city be requested to officiate in that service. As we have known for over 2 centuries, their prayers were answered. Though the assembly adjourned without a vote on Franklin's motion at that point they stopped their meeting, they broke for intermission, they all took a couple of days off, and they came back, and they came back and they were able to come up with the Constitution. Let me just read on this point. All impasses were broken, compromises on all issues struck, and solutions found. There arose what all felt to be a truly remarkable, almost odd, willingness for each side to set aside its concerns for the good of the whole. The spirit of selflessness and compromise that came over this body of opinionated, brilliant, and principled men was in the end sufficient for them to ratify the great document called the Constitution. Every participant marveled at what had happened. George Washington wrote about it in a letter to his friend, the Marquis de Lafayette. He quote this, quote, "It appears to me then little short of a miracle that the delegates from so many different states, which states you know are also different from each other in their manners and circumstances and prejudices, would unite in forming a system of national government so little liable to well-founded objections. James Madison was even more amazed, quote, "But the real wonder is that so many difficulties should have been surmounted, and surmounted with unanimity, almost as unprecedented as it must have been unexpected. It is impossible for any man of candor to reflect on this circumstance without partaking of the astonishment. It is impossible for the man of pious reflection not to perceive in it the finger of that almighty hand which has been so frequently and signally extended to our relief in the critical stages of the revolution. It is not less horrifying to consider what might have happened if the 55 men gathered in that summer of 1787 had failed to do what they set out to do. Could the stakes have been higher, knowing the role of America has played in the history of the world since that time? Could the timing of what they had done been more desperate? The French Revolution, which was just about to begin, would bitterly divide many of the founders, most notably John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, so that summer represented a swiftly closing window of opportunity into an unprecedented world, a world of ordered liberty that could last and would last, and somehow the founders got through it just in time, somehow. Why is it too much for us to suppose, as Franklin, Washington, Adams, and so many others did, that the finger of the Almighty indeed have been involved? This was an idea that did not die with the founders, but lived on and was kindled afresh by Abraham Lincoln, who faced obstacles every bit as difficult as what the founders faced, and who came to the same conclusion about how they must be surmounted. It is an idea that must not die with this generation. May God help us to keep it alive, not just for our sake, but for the sake of all those beyond our shores who hope to taste the freedom we enjoy, and for all those yet to be born. This is an excerpt from Metaxas's book, If You Can Keep It. When he talked about that, the title of his book was taken from the story about when they signed the Constitution finally. Ben Franklin was stepping down from the Independence Hall, and as he was coming down, a lady sidled up to him and said, "Mr. Franklin, what was it that you have given us?" And he said to her, "A republic, madam, if you can keep it." And that's the charge to us today.
Yeah,
They've given us a republic.
yeah.
It's up to us to keep it.
Keep it.
We've seen the miracles that God has worked up until the Constitutional Convention. With Ben Franklin coming up with his speech, now he was one of the least Christian of all that, but in his speech, I think there are 10 or 12 different biblical verses that he was referring to in his speech. He talked Bibleese, and that's the way our founders were. And if he was one of the least Christian religion, imagine where the other ones were at. All right. So understood that our founders knew the power of God, and the only way that we made it that far so far. And before we break for lunch and after lunch, we'll talk about from that point forward. But they knew that if it wasn't for the hand of God, we would be sunk as a nation.
Yeah, we need them again.
Yeah. Amen. Amen. So now we're going to go to session 3. We're going to go see the miracle at Newburgh. That's what I talked about. I had that slide for that, but I didn't have it in your notes. The Constitutional Convention, the miraculous victory on Lake Erie. That's what we're going to talk about after lunch, I guess. After lunch. Right. This is lunchtime.